Welcome to session 4. We are crossing the halfway point. You know, the scriptures tell us that Jesus would often slip away into the wild places to pray. And often when God wanted to shape his saints, he would carry them away out into desolate places to get them away from distraction and to cultivate their devotion. Abraham, Moses, the nation of Israel, David, when God wanted to carve into them character, he took them out to the wild places to cultivate devotion alone with God. And that's what this session's about. It's about how we can cultivate an intimacy with God. I know this is going to be encouragement for you. I'm excited to see how God uses it in your life. Well, we ended our last session by saying that our best weapon against temptation is to cultivate devotion. That the way we resist the lure of the enemy is by enjoying the love of the Father. The Puritans used to say it this way: how do you dislodge a beautiful thing from the human heart? You replace it with a more beautiful thing. We see this in Shakespeare. How did Romeo get rid of Rosalind? Do you even remember Rosalind? Go back and read Romeo and Juliet. At the beginning, Romeo is pining away for Rosalind, and he's going on and on about how beautiful she is, that finally Benvolio gets frustrated, and he says, dude, I'm taking you to a party tonight where there's like 100 girls hotter than Rosalind. It's a rough translation, but read it, it's there. And Romeo responds, the all-seeing sun has ne'er met her match since first the world begun. Oh, there's no one hotter than Rosalind. And then Romeo goes to the party and he sees Juliet. And that night, he sneaks into her yard and says, but soft, what light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. Arise, fair sun, and kill the envious moon, which is already sick and pale with grief, that thou, her maid, art far more fair than she. Rosalind, who? And the best way to dislodge a temptation from your heart is to cultivate a devotion with the God who loves you. We replace it with a more beautiful thing. There's a beautiful story told in the book of Hosea in the scriptures, where Hosea is called to marry a woman named Gomer, and Gomer wants to enjoy the illicit pleasures of the city. And so she goes into the city, forsakes her husband, and goes to enjoy the pleasures of the night, goes to indulge in all that the city has to offer. But like so many of us who have indulged in temptation, it offers to give so much, but it ends up taking more than it gives. And where you think you're going to add, it subtracts. And by the end of her life, she feels used, she is stripped naked, and she is being sold on an auction block. And in that moment, God tells Hosea, go to your woman and buy her back at full price. And God says, when you do that, you're like a picture of me with my wayward kids. It's a picture of salvation. And he says in Hosea chapter 2, therefore, behold, I will allure her, and I will bring her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. And there I will give her her vineyards and make the valley of Acre, that is the valley of trouble, a doorway of hope. He says, I will go to her and I won't judge and condemn her. I want to set her free from that slavery. And then I want to lure her out into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. And she will no longer call me master. She'll call me husband because she knows I'm the lover of her soul. And that's what God's done for us. So many of us have gone to all kinds of wayward roads for satisfaction, and it's taken more than it's given. And the beauty of the gospel is God wants to allure us and to speak tenderly to us and to call us to enjoy the love of our Father. And yet we live in an age where it's difficult to do that. Because some of us maybe do run to the city for its allurement, but the truth is modern technology has made that allure as close as our phones. That any moment of the day, we can see a whole universe accessible to us. And all these distractions that come into our world mitigate against this intimacy. And for many of us, we go to our phones not for information, but for validation, to feel loved, feel important, to feel seen, to feel noticed. And yet all this advance of technology has not led to human flourishing. And we're starting to see it now. That all this information has not made us more intelligent. The average IQ in the West has gone down. All this connection online has come at the cost of deep communion with others, with ourselves, and even with God. And all this distraction has mitigated against meditation and this pursuit of intimacy with God. It used to be in the quiet moments in our cars, in the quiet moments at home, laying in bed. It was just us and God. And as we would speak to him, that moment of reflection led to insight and innovation about our lives. How many billions of prayers have been lost over the last few years with the advent of technology? Where we used to sit in the quiet places with God, now we sit with our screens. Much of our modern life is not conducive to this kind of human flourishing. So we must now go to war to find rest. And the good news is the same mechanism the devil exploits, we can now turn for good. We can set our minds on thoughts of God, to stir our affections with a love for God, so we can begin to take actions that cultivate the intimacy with God we were made for. And yet it's interesting, if you notice in the book of Hosea, when God calls his people into that movement, hey, set your mind on me, let my love fill your heart, come walk with me. That movement, he said, I will allure her and bring her out into the wilderness. Why does he bring her into the wilderness? Well, frankly, because there's no people there. So it's less distracting. And that's what God likes to do. He said, let me pull you away from all the craziness to cultivate in you a love with me. And it's the same with you and me. We have to war for a rhythm of rest. And here again, Jesus helps us because Jesus developed that kind of rhythm in his earthly ministry. Jesus had 3 years to change the world. And yet in that, he never neglected a rhythm of moving into the city for intensity of ministry and then out into the wilderness to cultivate intimacy with his Father. And if he wasn't too busy for that rhythm, you aren't either. You see it in places like Mark, the Gospel of Mark, where he has a long day of ministry where he's casting out an unclean spirit in the synagogue, that he is healing Peter's sick mother-in-law, that the whole city comes to him and asks for healing, and he heals late into the night. And yet as dawn breaks the next day, Mark says in Mark chapter 1, verse 35, and rising very early in the morning, while it was still dark, he departed and went out to a desolate place, and there he prayed. And as his ministry went on, Luke tells us in Luke 5, it says, but now even more the reports about him went abroad. Great crowds gathered to hear him and to be healed from their infirmities. But he would often withdraw to the desolate places and pray. That Jesus developed that rhythm into the city of intensity and ministry, and then out into the wilderness to cultivate intimacy. And we're meant to do the same thing. And I want to encourage you to develop that rhythm in your life. The best fight against deception and temptation is to cultivate devotion. Now, to do that, I would encourage you to think in 2 categories: consistency and creativity. Consistency and creativity. You need a consistent rhythm of cultivating intimacy with the Lord. I would encourage you to have a daily rhythm of loading my mind with thoughts of God, because thoughts are the fuel of the furnace of our affections. And as I load my mind with thoughts of God, it builds up a fire of my affections for God, and that drives the engines of my actions to pursue the glory of God in the world. For me, that works out best early in the morning. If I wait to let my kids wake me up, their crazy kind of activates my crazy, and it starts the whole day off on the wrong foot. So I have to rise up while it is still dark to sit with the Lord so I can be prepared to be the father and the husband and the minister and the man I want to be. Yours doesn't have to be early in the morning, but I would encourage you to find a time, a place, and a plan. Find a time when you're undistracted and can focus. Find a place where you're not going to get disrupted, but you can focus in on the words of God. And then come up with a plan so that every day you're not wondering, what should I read? Where do I go? Maybe you move through a book of the Bible. For me, when I was young, I would write out books of the Bible by hand. It took a long time. I'd maybe write 1 or 2 verses a day. But as I did that, it would slowly etch these words of God, not just on the page, but in me. And as they loaded into my mind, they walked with me throughout the day. I remember when I was a youth pastor, I had a young man come to Christ, and he was so excited to know that God could forgive him and love him. And he said, what do I do now? And I said, well, man, You're meant to know him. All love seeks knowledge of the beloved. And so if you love God, you need to fill your mind with thoughts of God. And so I said, so let's figure out a plan. I said, what's a good time? I said, how about first thing in the morning? He said, no, that's not going to work. Like, what do you mean? He's like, man, I barely show up to school clothed. I can't focus in the morning. It's like, all right. I said, how about last thing at night? He said, I can't do that either. Like, what do you mean? And he said, well, if I lay in bed and start praying, I fall asleep. And I was like, I get that. I've been there. Where you lay in bed and you're like, Lord, and it's like, doesn't really work. And I said, well, then is there any time of day that you can focus? And he stopped and thought for a moment. And he said, 3 o'clock. He said, I come home from school and I do nothing. He said, I sit on the couch and eat chips. And I was like, okay, 3 o'clock, it's a date. I said, how about a place? Is there a place you can focus? And I said, how about a coffee shop? Because at that time in my life, that's where I met with the Lord. And I got to be honest with you, as soon as I sat down with a great cup of coffee, the Spirit was already moving even before I read my Bible. I was so happy to be there in that place. And I said, how about a coffee shop? And he said, nah, I can't focus there. I was like, well, you might want to pray about that, man. I don't know what's going on with that. And I said, well, then how about your bedroom? He said, nah, there's too much stuff I mess with there. I said, then is there any place on the globe you can focus? And he thought for a moment and he said, my garage. There's no one in my garage. I said, then it's a date. 3 o'clock in your garage, you and God. And at that moment, our church, we were going through the book of Colossians, and I told him, write out the words of Colossians. And I got to tell you, it was the coolest thing that every week he would come up to me and say, hey, Ben, I ran into this issue at school. And you know, Colossians says this. Or, hey, Ben, I ran into this issue with my parents. And then I remembered Colossians said this. Hey, Ben, I was discouraged about that. And then I set my mind on things above, like Colossians says. And on, he realized all these thoughts about God in my mind were changing my heart of how I felt about God in the world. And it was changing the way I lived and moved in the world, that he was cultivating intimacy with a consistent rhythm. And I want you to do the same. It's interesting, in Atomic Habits, James Clear talks about this choice architecture. He says that we don't rise to the level of our aspirations, we fall to the levels of our systems. He used the example of a group of people who were challenged to work out. He said one group of people were just told, exercise. The other group was told, exercise, but here's a motivational speech. And the third group was told, exercise, and here's a plan of how to do it every day. He said out of that first group, about 35 worked out consistently, 35%. Out of that second group that heard the motivational speech, the numbers went up to 38%. But the group that didn't get the motivational speech, but got the plan of action, over 90% worked out on a consistent basis. Something about consistency is a great predictor of efficiency, productivity, and you need that, a consistent way of I'm going to meet with God. First thing in the morning, late at night, into the intensity of the city, out into the wilderness to meet with him. So we cultivate intimacy with God with consistency, but we also do it with creativity. Find different ways to enjoy God through enjoying all that he's made. And that's where this can get really fun. I had one friend that said, he loved to go on dates with God. It wasn't his normal devotional moment, but he would just pick different days where he said, I would go to a park and buy a pizza and go on a date with Jesus. And I thought, man, that sounds great, but I don't know that I want to date Jesus. I don't really want to say it that way, but that's cool that that works for you. Or I had another friend tell me, man, I love to go to graveyards and consider the brevity of life as I pray. And I'm like, yeah, I don't want to do that either. But you just find different ways to enjoy time with the Lord. For me, I love to go on walks with the Lord and pray. I remember I developed that in college because I realized I didn't pray that much. And my church had a 24-hour prayer network where you could sign up for 1 hour to pray so that someone from the church or some people were praying every hour of the day. I picked around 10 o'clock on Sunday nights. And when I first started it, I remember I knelt down by my bed because I thought kneeling was spiritual. And I prayed for myself, and I prayed for my roommates, and then I prayed for our neighborhood, and I prayed for our college campus, and the city, and the nation, and the world. And then I looked at the clock, and it had been about 2 minutes. I was like, oh man, an hour's a long time. And then I fell asleep. And I felt really bad about that. So the next week, I tried praying in my closet, because I remember I'd read a verse about praying in your closet. And as I got in there, it was so warm and snuggly with all my clothes just thrown on the ground, I fell asleep in about 1 minute. And felt really bad about it. And then I realized, man, the only way I'm going to do this is if I stay moving. And if I try to just pray within my head, my thoughts just tend to move in circles. I got to pray out loud. So my neighbors probably all thought I was nuts, but they just see me walking down the street on a Sunday night talking to God. It's like, and then he says to me, and I'm processing with the Lord. And over time, I began to love that rhythm. God and I on Sunday nights would sit in a football stadium. We sat on the roof of a local high school. And even today, I love to go on walks with God in the woods. You find a way that works for you. I had a student in my ministry that came to Christ and he said, Ben, I want to walk with God. What do I do? And I said, well, love seeks knowledge of the beloved. You got to load your mind with thoughts of God to stir your affections for God so you'll want to live alongside him. And he said, well, Ben, I can't read. I was like, oh man, what do you mean you can't read? You're a senior in high school. And he's like, I never learned. And I'm like, oh man, we're going to have to figure that out. Let's help you do that. But we got to do something. I don't know. And he came back to me a few days later and he was like, Ben, do you know you can buy an audio Bible? You can pull it up and have someone read it to you? And I was like, man, that's great. And he found an audio Bible that was a bit more of a dramatic reading. It kind of had some keys in the background and the writer would say, and the Lord said, and we were like, ooh, that's nice. And so this kid decided on my drive to school and my drive home, rather than listen to songs or talk on the phone, I'm going to listen to the Word of God. And I'll never forget, he came to my office once and he was like, Ben, you got to hear this. Because normally the guy that read it was fairly subdued. But as we read this one part, he was talking about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And the reader said, and the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah. And we were like, what? That was crazy. Rewind it. Listen to that again. And we laughed about it. So every time I saw him in his car, we would yell, sulfur. And it was a little silly, but I knew if he's in his car, he's loading his mind with thoughts of God. And this young believer, his senior year of high school, listened to the entire Bible over and over again just on that trip to school and back. And some of us, if I can be honest, you've maybe been a follower of Jesus for years, and there's so much of his word that has never entered your mind. So find a creative way that works for you. Listen to an audio Bible while you get ready for work. Do what I do, where maybe once a month you just steal away for a whole day. We call it a day with the Lord, where we just sneak away to spend the day with him. I often wonder on those days, what will he and I talk about? And I'm surprised often at how fast the time goes. Do whatever you can. Find in whatever place, whatever time, whatever plan to help stoke the flames of your affections for God so you can live for him. We're meant to cultivate that devotion, to enjoy God, and again, it is the surest protection against the allure of sin. St. Augustine, one of the greatest thinkers in Christian history, wrestled with sexual addiction. And as he contemplated conversion to Christianity, he was so scared to lose this pursuit of sexual enjoyment illicitly with women. And yet finally at one moment he realized, I believe Jesus is who he says he is, and so I need to know him. And so he came to put his faith in Christ, and then he wrote in his journey, he said, how sweet it was to be rid of those fruitless joys I once so feared to lose. He said, you drove them from me, and you took their place. You who are sweeter than all pleasure. How do you dislodge a beautiful thing from the human heart? You replace it with the more beautiful thing. There is nothing in existence more beautiful and soul satisfying than your God. So load your mind with thoughts of him, so your heart will be stirred with affections for him. And then let's run in the paths of his commands, because he set our hearts free. Think about it. How can you harness your time and energy to pursue devotion to your King? Make a list and then execute it for his glory and for your good.